Hey, what's good, ReFi Nation? John here from ReFi DAO with my good friend Simar from Magic Ventures. We're looking forward to bringing another episode this week with David Rodriguez from Draft Ventures. David is an investor and entrepreneur who's been active in the space across SaaS, blockchain, and now getting into the ReFi movement. He's raising a new fund with an emerging thesis that he'll explore with you. And yeah, it's been one of my favorite conversations we've had in a while. He was so clear and articulate. As an investor who's recently raised a fund at Magic Ventures, Simar, I'm curious what in this episode really resonated with you that you're taking?
David really embodies so much of both the heart of what ReFi is about, the journey that he's been on, the sort of call to action, the listening, the seeing what wants to happen, coupled with that deep thoughtfulness around how do you actually find the leverage points to make real change and create and scale real impact. So I think just that clarity of thinking coupled with just how deep and big his heart is was just so beautiful to witness. And I think this episode just carries so much beauty and gold in both the content as well as how deep and caring and in flow the conversation is. So, this again, similar, one of my favorite conversations. I think it's going to be a great episode.
Absolutely. Before we drop the episode, just quick call to anybody listening who've enjoyed the podcast so far. Leave a quick review, share it with somebody who's exploring the climate space. Be super grateful to help get the story of regeneration out to the masses. And without further ado, here we go, a conversation with David. Hey, good morning, David. Thanks so much for coming on, man. How are you?
Really good. Thanks for having me.
Definitely. Cool. Simar and I have been looking forward to this conversation for a while. Excited to dive into things. It seems like since we met at that cafe in Barcelona just before Cello Connect, so much has happened and you've really become an integral part of this movement in ReFi. And yeah, looking forward to hearing you describe the work that you do and the story about how you got here. For those who haven't had the pleasure of getting to know you, how do you describe the work that you do and the journey that you took to get here?
Oh, great. Well, first off, thanks for having me. Super excited to chat with you too and to share some of my story with the audience here. I run Draft Ventures, a seed stage venture capital fund. I've run this fund for over 7 years with one partner, Artia Mogbel. And during that time, we've invested in about 75 companies, 8 of which have gone on to become unicorns. And it's been a top decile fund of its vintage. And while I've been investing, I've always been operating companies for most of that time. And I've always looked at it as invest in companies, learn these kind of broader themes and theses and find which one of those companies resonate, advise those companies, and then jump in and operate. And I usually wear the COO hat when I operate. And I've grown a few companies as COO and scaled them from that pre-product market fit stage to scale. One of those companies was called Livefire in the marketing software space, and joined that company around 20 people, and we grew that to a few hundred people and sold it to Adobe. And I had the pleasure of doing that. My most recent company was a company called Side Inc., and that was in the real estate technology space. And we were the first investors in that company, and as it grew, helped advise and then jumped in as a COO and helped scale that company from kind of pre-Series A to post-Series C. And that's company since scaled to a company that was just valued at about $2.5 billion on the private markets from Co2 and Tiger and D1, a few other big pre-IPO funds. And most recently, we're launching a new fund that's entirely focused on climate software and impact finance. And that's something we're just so excited about, and been spending most of the last 2 years in those spaces.
Wow, David, so cool to hear your story. I mean, particularly on the professional front. I'm curious, like now as you start to think about impact and climate, what has been the journey to that particular domain? Would love to hear more.
Yeah, for me, it started over a decade ago. I lived in Mozambique and worked on a project there it was a Bill and Melinda Gates grant. And the project was really this forestry sector in Mozambique was identified as the highest opportunity to raise the most people out of poverty and also have beneficial environmental effects. And I worked for an organization called TechnoServe and lived in Mozambique and led a project across locals and expats that were on my team and helped to start this and cultivate this industry. And I was working with the ministers in the government to foreign investors to all the entrepreneurs in the ground. And we did things like I created an industry association there, and it was really at the time I think it was both extremely motivating and also demotivating. And on the demotivating side, we saw the destruction of the native forests that were happening in Mozambique, which is a very developing country at the time. I think it was 8th on the bottom of the World Development Index. And also saw the challenges with growing forestry plantations, even though all the conditions were right in Mozambique for that to happen. And even when you do that, there's challenges with that because there's drives to do more monoculture forestry plantations and things, which also have challenges for the environment. And it took me from that experience and kind of integrating those challenges and building my own personal career over a decade to come back to it. And I think I started coming back to it. It was about 3 years ago, where I just had some tough times personally. I think I ended my last operating stint. I was a place of transition, some personal adversity. I went through a minor depression, and from that place of kind of loss and confusion, I was just in a deep state of listening and inquiry. And for me, it was like the question became, what am I willing to give myself to? It wasn't like, what do I do next? It was, what do I want to build for life in the decades to come? Like, what's this life's work? And I started stepping into that. And in that, some of this experience from Mozambique came up and where I find my joy in nature, and also, this desire to, how do we kind of stop most suffering in the world, and what's most pressing for humanity? And, climate came, loud and clear through as what I needed to step into. And so from that point, it was great. Now, how do I apply my talents, my resources, my magic in this space? And I always look for where are the leverage points that can have the highest impact, create that inflection. And, we had at the time I had the platform of Draft Ventures and started looking at it as an investor. And it was, where are the kind of new technologies, inflection point technologies that weren't available a few years ago that, when applied through the lens of climate, can really have this outsized opportunity and effect. And at that time, one thing we looked at was and typically we're RT and I and Draft Ventures, we're strong software investors, but we started looking at the space, and it was very clear that drone technology was going through this process where it just had climbed Moore's law, and the sensors from LiDARs and cameras to the drone tech was just getting so small and cheap, and no one had applied it to, or it was just starting being applied to climate. And it was just such a nice thesis and entryway to really dive in. And we wound up looking both at the MRV space and what are the challenges on MRV is measurement, reporting, and verification, and how do we use drones to and sensors to do better measurement, reporting, and verification. And there's really only manual processes of measuring, and we found an amazing company called TreeSwift out of UPenn that were the leading company in applying multi-robot systems to measuring natural landscapes. And it was clear that they were going to be the winner in the space. And I would say it's clear, but it was the right team and it was the right thesis. And we invested in that company, and that's been a great way to really dig in the climate space, because they've also came and do it from commercial forestry, and we've kind of been working with the founder to move more and more into climate, and we've kind of been on that journey together, which has been great. The second was looking at not only measuring natural landscapes, but how do we plant these natural landscapes and restore them? And drones, in that application, we invested in a company called Drone Seed that's using drones to fly over land and drop pellets that are kind of these fertilized pucks of seeds and shoot them down into the ground and restore forests. And it's some really amazing technology, and beats using a shovel to plant trees. And that was an initial thesis we had that a few years ago was a nice way to step into place. And I said, after that, I think the next big milestone for us was, and John's familiar with the story, was, when Toucan started bringing carbon credits on the blockchain. And it was like, wow, what an aha moment for me and for us. And we've been investing in the Web3 space for a long time. And we're really lucky to kind of catch the initial kind of rounds and fundings of some big protocols and layer ones, and kind of invested along the Web3 spectrum as that market matured. And when you look at something like an antiquated market like carbon credits and these eco assets, and you're like, wow, the lens of blockchains through this, and like, wow, you can create a better registry. You have this immutability and transparency and provenance that comes with blockchain. And you're like, wow, you can create all these financial products and derivatives with this technology and bring down the power of fungibility of tokens and DeFi into the climate space. And that will create all this impact. And then you're like, whoa, this space doesn't even have the opportunity for collaboration and the things like interoperability and postability were the things that were like, once that happens and you come from a place of, we have years here to fix this problem. And it's almost like the only way to get there is if we have technologies that have features like compostability, where you can have this exponential innovation building on top of each other that we've seen in Web3. And to apply that to climate was just really, really motivating. And so we invested in Toucan and a handful of other companies in this Web3 ReFi climate space. And so that was kind of and I think that culminates, what we've invested in, around 10 or so companies in and around the space. And, I think we've moved to a place where we've fully validated our beliefs and our theses around it, and are launching this new fund because we believe there's such an opportunity, not only for impact, but just to create financial returns that are commensurate with the size and scale of this opportunity.
And looking at the new fund that's coming ahead, how are you articulating that thesis to these LPs? What's the kind of case for investing in ReFi at this particular point in time, given everything that you guys have seen and what you see moving forward?
So at the highest level, our thesis, we're underwriting two major trends we see. I think one is like this, that our ecology of our planet's in peril. And there's going to be trillions of dollars that are invested into this over the next decade. And on that trend, if you use like carbon as just a proxy for it, we're at roughly 50 gigatons of carbon being emitted into the atmosphere. That's up from 5 gigatons in the 1950s and like nothing when you go back, a few hundred years. And, we have basically the Paris Agreement in 2015 set a quota of carbon we can emit. And, give or take, we have around 400 gigatons left. And you do the math and it's like an immediate, by the end of the decade type of action that we need. And you look at where we are, and there's such a gap in technology and capital that's flowing into the space that we have visibility on now, from things like net zero commitments and private capital being raised and things like that are going to flow into the space. And for us, that's a thesis that we want to really invest on and double down in and underwrite. And the second trend is really this transition of financial systems, and that we're at an inflection point of technologies disrupting financial systems. And that means new classes of financial products and assets. That means things like software and protocols that are removing middlemen in the system and cutting out these middle costs and creating new opportunities. It's things like empowering individuals and businesses with technologies and financial products and services that were never, available before. And that's across Web 2 and Web 3. And I think we look at this as what we have an opportunity to underwrite this trend with a focus on on capital redistribution towards inclusion and wealth equality, and moving capital towards world positive assets, which kind of loops into that first theme. And we look at both of these themes and trends as really connected as we move into this next fund. And for us, it's this it's the Larry Fink found quote around like the next 1,000 unicorns won't be search engines or social media companies. They'll be sustainable, scalable innovators and looking to decarbonize the world and making this energy transition affordable for consumers. And we're really laser focused on this. And this is these are multi-trillion-dollar opportunities where we just are getting these technologies and seeing these inflection points in these technologies to invest in. And for me, it's the most exciting time I've seen in venture from my life.
It is so real. And there's so much here to like unpack and just riff on. One thing, David, you mentioned this, and I just wanted to briefly touch on this just before we move forward, is you mentioned that one point where you were really listening for what wanted to come through. I'm just curious, how did you go about that listening process through which climate really came through?
I think for me, it was, first coming from a place of not knowing, right? And surrendering to that of, I had a narrative in my head that, I was the serial COO. I was going to, be a success, could keep being successful and build bigger and bigger companies. And I was really looking, okay, what's the next one? It's the next one. And, I think I said, okay, what if that wasn't the story? What if I take a step back from that immediate next thing and listen and sit in a place of saying like what wants to come through, where's like the alignment with the core me of who I am with my values and how I want to show up in this world. And it was less doing, and more just sitting and being. And this was during COVID where I had that, some space to do that, and where, things were just naturally getting like stirred up for the world. And I mean, that was kind of that process and that rebirth process for me. And I did it in a place of yes, coming from a place of confusion and loss, but also from a place of gratitude and having resources where I could be in that place of inquiry. And that's a privilege, right? To be able to take that time. And sitting on a place where I was investing in capital and had a fund and had the purview to be like, also as I listened to then, interact with those messages and test them and look at them. As I explained a little before. But yeah, that's where I came from. Thanks for asking.
It's such an amazing moment, I think, for your journey as well as the human story. COVID forced so many of us inside, literally and metaphorically, and seeing the fruits of that inquiry in your life is so moving and powerful. And just imagining the history books that will look back at this period of time and say, that was it. That period of chaos, that period of suffering forced an entire generation of people to reevaluate what mattered and to reapproach their lives with a new understanding of who we are and how we show up on earth. And I really feel confident that we have the tools required to address this complex crisis. We have the capital on the sidelines ready to connect to a better world. And I'm so grateful to see people like you who really hold a bar of excellence enter into this space and lead and take this forward. And so, yeah, man, it feels like an amazing time to be alive. And it's great to share this space with you. Just stepping back from that insight, I'm curious like how you personally define regenerative finance. We refer to it as ReFi, but what's your definition in the space? How do you make a read on it?
Yeah. I think for me, it starts back with John Fullerton in 2015 when he laid out the principles of regenerative economics. And I mean, his basic thesis was that regeneration really is the process that delivers sustainable living systems as an outcome of that process. And that has, when we look at where we are today and from a first principles basis, just our economic system, where like the driving force of that is total shareholder value. And that comes at the expense of the opposite of what John Fullerton describes, right? It's appropriating resources and moving them from the domain of the commons into the domain of the money system. And often with that comes these negative externalities, which are have massive consequences for us in the world. And when I think of that in the context of like what is ReFi, what is regenerative, it's to solve those two challenges, right? It's to change the direction towards total shareholder returns to sustainable living systems, and in that compensating and more than compensating for these negative externalities. And I think when we think about what ReFi gives us this opportunity, this ReFi space, and I think a lot of ReFi is more of the Web3 application towards this, as we have all these systems and tools now from the blockchain to really change the incentives and the dynamics around how money works, around how these around creating new incentive structures and systems and coordination systems, where we can step into that, creating these sustainable living systems that fit this definition of regeneration.
Yeah, gosh. Just to build on that, I think one of the things that's really interesting is like, if we think about how much, I feel like we've lived in the world, right, and in nature, assuming almost infinite, potential energy. We're looking at our living systems and being like, great, we can just keep extracting and moving into this other realm. And so we haven't had a way yet, I think really had a deep conversation around what does that reverse reaction look like? How do we actually regenerate and build back the systems that we're using in a way that actually, to your point, David, I think is beautiful, right? It's almost like regenerative economics, really at the heart of it is just like the process by which we create economics that can create sustainable living systems, and all the dimensions to that are in service of that, blockchain, all of this other, it's sort of like, well, and I think there's great promise there, right? Of like creating a scaffolding and a structure that can, create a certain, even a nervous system that can support a kind of more regenerative, set of structures. Because we're going to need to innovate on the technological side and on the economic side and how we think about value. Yeah, John, I'm curious, for you, what are some of the things, like, I feel like we've been in this conversation now too, across the season. What are the elements of ReFi that are, like coming up for you now?
Yeah, it's nice hearing everyone's definition. I was listening to a podcast with Gregory Landua in the creator economy, and he has a different flavor, but a similar expression. But I really like your take on this, David. And I know I'd kind of entered into the space and had this kind of conscious evolution that started with all of this hype and focus on carbon and climate. And I called that like the first pillar of ReFi. And it's really like trying to stabilize the climate, because we now recognize actually this is really important and we depend upon it to survive. And in the process of exploring like, okay, well, what is a carbon credit? What's actually happening? And why does it matter? You realize it's actually about diverse living systems where all of life is valued and recognized as an asset. And that kind of shaped this second pillar around restoring ecosystems and having broader measures of planetary health beyond just concentrations of carbon dioxide. And I think, the kind of segue from there is recognizing that humans are actually just a part of life. We are not these, dominating species that are meant to control everything and put everything to our submission. Actually, like, we're part of this dance, we're part of this fabric. And when you realize that, there's suddenly this calling for justice that emerges, where you realize how unjust and inequitable and unequal our societies are. And I think there's a lot to go into on that third pillar around social justice that I'd be curious to get your thoughts on, David. I know you guys are active in the financial inclusion side, maybe some specific examples of stuff you guys have invested in, but this really, goes back to your thesis that you described. Would love to hear more about like why that's integral to addressing this climate crisis and how those pieces really fit together.
Good question. I'll start with answering your part on the financial inclusion, then step back a little bit and address more of your delineation of your path of defining those three pillars of regenerative economics. But on the financial inclusion, this is, to your point, I think we are looking across all those three pillars. And when you get to that third pillar of, okay, how do we consider humanity as an integral part of these regenerative systems? We started looking at those spaces around 2-3 years ago. And one of the things that emerged as we are kind of looking at these theses and deep in Web3 was this category of real world asset lending, and how we can use the power of the blockchain to include more of humanity in that story. And we invested in a company called Goldfinch. And what Goldfinch is doing is they've created a distributed, a protocol to do lending to microfinance institutions that are across the developing world, primarily in making microfinance loans. And this hits on a number of the themes I mentioned earlier around cutting out middlemen and using the power of a protocol instead of traditional finance infrastructure. And taking a step back, we're looking more broadly, and we ask the question of where does centralized finance perhaps not make the most sense to either underwrite specific risk or even service the debt that's outstanding. And we came quickly to microfinance as one of those areas where actually some guy in Tower and Madison Avenue in New York may not be the best person to do that. And actually, if we use the power of a distributed protocol, there's a lot of that could be applied, and we can create multi-billion-dollar companies in that way. And Goldfinch was one of the early investments in that space, as I described, and they're over 100 million in AUM now that have been raised and to be deployed towards microfinance, and it's been a really big success in the space. And we just invested in another really interesting company that goes one step further, where where Goldfinch is using the power of blockchain to lend to micro lenders, those institutions and banks that are lending. We invested in a company called Gia, which may not be announced yet, but a little alpha. And Gia is super exciting because they're using the power of the blockchain to invest in or to lend to small businesses directly, and using a protocol to do that. And we saw kind of a lot of the DeFi boom happen, and a large part of that is credit and lending, and a lot of that was done with under collateralized and only on-chain liquidity. And what's really interesting about this whole real world asset space, and I'll step back even further than just looking at kind of this inclusion that you asked about, John, and that I'm sharing about, is when we look at how blockchain interacts with the real world, and we start bringing different assets on chain, and this we can come on to this when we talk about the carbon credit ecosystem, but more broadly, it's how do we start deploying more capital to these world positive causes. And when we do that with the power of blockchain, and we can look at all these categories that really make sense for a non-centralized solution here. And when I think about this just from an investor perspective, I'm like, we don't need the entire world to change or the entire financial system to change. We need segments of these asset classes, whether that's bringing energy, renewable energy assets on chain and lending to them on chain. Like we don't need 100% of the market to move on chain. We need like single digit percentages and to create many multi-billion-dollar companies. And so that's an area that we're just really excited about and investing in, and we'll continue to underwrite. And another like a real world asset, in doing that in the light of what are the real world assets that actually have that are underserved and that are going to have their moment, because these trends of climate that we're seeing, and renewable energies and infrastructure is one of them. We just invested in a company called Silta that's also they're using kind of bringing real world assets and infrastructure projects like big renewable energy projects in the PPP space on chain and providing on-chain liquidity to those projects in a similar fashion. So that's what, that's an area that we're really excited about. And then the second part, to come back to the dialogue that Simar and John were having around, the three pillars. What we've seen right now is that there's this almost myopic concentration on the first pillar, and for good reason, right? We look at, especially in ReFi, right? And when we look at, okay, where's venture capital, where's the talent going? And it's really focused around this voluntary carbon credit ecosystem. And, that's an area that has a known market cap of over $1 billion that's growing from where it is now to, if you look at the McKinsey estimates, $50 billion by the end of the decade, up to $100 billion if you look at some of the UN's projections. And we know that's a fast-growing market. We know it's a big market, and we know it's doesn't have the technologies that that meet its needs, especially to grow another 10 to 100x in the next decade. And so there's a great opportunity to innovate and build for sure, and we see a concentration. But when I think about what do we need as what does humanity need to fight this, and where have we kind of gone wrong in this story? There is this kind of almost a reductionist frame around carbon and carbon and greenhouse gases, and how our the Paris Agreement and everything's really focused on getting to this net zero place. And that's right. And there's a broader picture. And I always love, I spent a lot of time with Charles Eisenstein, and his latest book was Climate: A New Story. And his thesis there, it's always helpful to come back to, which he looks at the problem's bigger than the single reductionist metric of carbon, and that almost does a disservice because it puts this emphasis on fossil fuels and less emphasis on kind of ecosystems and biodiversity and our watersheds and our wetlands and our soil and our forests. And his perspective is we really need to put more emphasis on it because the planet is alive, and we can't look at it just as this input-output machine we can monkey with those two levers to change things, because as a living being, the organs and the tissues of this earth are what's required for it to thrive. And that's the rainforests and the wetlands and how humanity interacts with it. And when I think about that in terms of you apply that, okay, that's a great thesis, but how do we build in that? How do we build that? And I think when I think through that, it's and what's to come over the next decade or 2 decades, it's the carbon credits are just a sliver of the challenges that we're facing, right? And I think as an investment theme, it's just like, where can we innovate beyond the carbon credit? And even if you look at like the UN lays out the Sustainable Development Goals, there's 17 of them, right? That we need as humanity, that the authority says, right? Climate is one of those, right? It's goal 13. And of that, carbon credits really touches a few of the targets of that, right? And what we're really talking about here, of carbon credits, really an impact claim. And it's a rigidly defined impact claim because you need like a baseline measurement and additionality and verification and all these things to make a carbon credit happen. And what happens then is that, we miss all this stuff that is much broader than that. And even within carbon, we're missing stuff. Like if you're a landowner with less than 1,000 acres, good luck getting a carbon credit because it's too costly for you to set up, to go through the validator, to spend, and there's not enough throughput in the system for you to move that through. And by the way, it may take you a few years to get your carbon credit. Like that's an area that needs innovation within carbon. And if you're, innovating new technologies in carbon, with the current registries and standards, it's going to take you hundreds of thousands of dollars or more, and maybe a year or more to get those methodologies approved before you can have impact. So these are bottlenecks that I'm really looking at my investment thesis just within carbon to remove. And even that, like, do we define a carbon credit the right way? Because right now it's just, can we add there's some thinking around, can we add an axis of time? So instead of a carbon credit just being removal of tons, it's, there's a time axis of a carbon ton year, which can create different incentives, which create financial opportunity. And I think back, going to what an impact claim is, that's carbon. So much is, beyond just carbon, right? It's right now we talk a lot about co-benefits with the carbon credit. And these are things like what other impacts happen with the generation of this carbon credit that are world positive, like biodiversity and soil and benefits to vulnerable groups. And I think over time we'll look at, how do we fund and incentivize and create financial products around impact claims that are not carbon credits. And there's going to be a lot of innovation there. And I think we're, rightfully so, we're early, but we're seeing some really smart entrepreneurs start to just innovate in those areas. And that's exciting.
So real. Yeah, it feels like it's all, there's such an interdisciplinary way of thinking. It feels like it's being called forth, a holistic way of looking at how these, because like the world is a multivariate system. It's not, we unfortunately can't reduce it to one variable input-out equation. It's just, there's so many different things that are happening at the same time. David, I'm curious from your perspective and from what you've seen now, what are the sort of either traits or ways of showing up that you've seen for founders that are successful in the space? I'm curious if there's like specific ways of either thinking or particular disciplines that you have found to be important to really actually put together this like more holistic map in how to approach the space.
Yeah. So for us, as we look at kind of our investment theses, we take this top downs and bottoms up approach, right? I think that the top down is to really develop a market view of the space, understand where the pockets within that market, which have those characteristics of, large total addressable market, rapidly growing, and then, room for innovation. And by, room for innovation, that's just like, it's not, a red sea of crowded companies. There's not the technology that's needed for it to grow and to be. There's that gap in technology that we can start to identify, even if we don't know what the companies are within it. And so, we'll identify these sectors and then meet with every company and all the founders in those sectors and understand their thesis and how we're going through to both validate, what we're thinking. And, in that validation process, we go to this kind of bottoms up view of things, of where we're meeting with the talent and the people who are building. And we, at the end of the day, at Draft Ventures, we're investing in people. We're investing in those founders that have the characteristics to win and do what it takes to create global impact and change, and build companies that will, earn that financial return that we expect and we promise to our LPs. And there's certain types of people you get to know over the years. And I've had the pleasure of both investing in hundreds of CEOs and also working really closely as the number two in companies on this trajectory, and knowing the psychology of a CEO and of a founder and how you move through it and what it takes. And I look for those, I look for those types of people that, are, for better or worse, like crazy enough to make these changes in the world and build these companies. And, for me, it's that I laugh when I said crazy, because it is this like reality distortion field that you can bend reality and not just your own, but like the field around you to make the impossible possible and feel possible now. Right. And it's bending that, like that reality distortion with this humbleness and inquiry and desire to grow and it's so funny because when RT and I talk to entrepreneurs, we know a space deeply enough to really engage founders in that way, and it's been a joy to do that within the ReFi space. And what we're looking for is like, are they asking questions? Well, are they just talking to telling us their view of the world? And it's also my old business partner, Guy Gal, who built Side as one of the founders of Side with me, he always used to say, I'd rather be successful than right. And, it's something that always stuck with me, of like something I look for in entrepreneurs. And Guy's one of the best entrepreneurs of our time. And I really look for those types of qualities, and then it's the people.
Nice, man. Well said. Yeah, it's always a double-edged sword, that reality distortion field. But when you get it right and people are moving in the positive direction and taking people along them with, I think it's a hard thing to both build a regenerative work environment and change the world. Like, I think, there's a big calling out there. I'm curious a little bit, in terms of your own internal dynamic. Like, you're juggling a lot, you're doing a lot. What do you do to maintain that center and core? Because I really sense a very strong, caring heart from you. You bring people together, you're really interested in relationships. Like, what are some of those core practices that keep you grounded into the heart of what really matters to you, going back to those insights you had earlier in your journey?
I have a number of practices that kind of keep me both grounded and productive and just alive in the way that's balanced. That goes from my morning routines, from the second I wake up, and how I move in the world, to stepping into various parts of passions and flow states of mine. And I think the third thing is, for me, family and community and relationships is everything. And I've done a lot to orient my life around those themes of family and community and relationships. And it's one of those things that's a huge passion of mine, of how I can nourish and be nourished in that way, so I can be doing the things I want to move in the world. So yeah.
Well said, man. And as you look into the ReFi community, what are the things that this movement needs to do to really realize its full potential?
Yeah, so I think, the ReFi, kind of looking at the ReFi Web3 space and going back to there's an amazing amount of talent that's coming into the space, and some great new tools that we're using in the space, and an influx of capital in the space. And so we have a lot going for us in ReFi. And especially we're seeing in this bear market, that community collaborating and coming together in ways that I haven't seen in V1 of Web3 before it was called Web3, or even in investing in traditional software. There was never that type of collaboration and that camaraderie and that alignment. And so I think there's a benefits there, and and we're already doing a lot. That's good. We need to look at ReFi as more than carbon credit ecosystem, a bit about what I was talking about before, and innovating in new spaces, in adjacent spaces. And there's a joke in this space that there's I can't even think about looking at another carbon credit marketplace because there's dozens already. And it's true. It's that's a pitch I hear often. And I think what do we need to do? We need to start thinking about these bigger themes that we're going to need to innovate on over the next decade if we're going to get to anywhere near these Paris Agreement goals, or anywhere near beyond the Paris Agreement goals, and attaching the Sustainable Development Goals, and building the next generation of technologies and companies to help humanity meet them. And I think a lot of that's going to happen with financial infrastructure, software, and technologies around that. And that's what I was sharing is it's a big part of our thesis. And so my hope to the space is, and I'll talk specifically to the Web3 aspect of ReFi. It's, let's go broader than carbon. And even within carbon, let's reach out of our Web3 bubbles to the people that have been operating and developing in climate for the last few decades, and have that expertise, that understand the international policy, that understand the intricacies of even the existing markets, so we can and start from there and innovate beyond them, right? I mean, that has to happen. And then, let's look at some of these, broader financial markets and pockets of margins and fees that can be removed as middlemen, that can be, and new areas that can be expanded from the current system with some of these technologies. And we'll keep, that's where we're going to keep our eyes and keep funding. Last point I'll make on this is, what else do we need? Because I want to leave our listeners with a call to action. We need awesome founders and talent in this space in a way that I don't see fully exist. And when I say that, I want more serial entrepreneurs that have are climbing their second mountain or third mountain and innovating in climate or fintech impact or these spaces that matter and that are massive. Like, I want to see more of those archetypes, not, because we got a lot of the, I'm a DeFi hacker that moved into this space. I'm an engineer that's, in blockchain that's, passionate about nature and climate, but not these, serial entrepreneur types that have kind of that acumen around building, world-changing businesses and venture scale businesses. And so, call to action if there's any of you out there that are like, hey, I want to, I've had some success. I want to start innovating in this space. I want to help, get those figures up to speed in the space, fund those people, and help them make the impact that they want to make.
So beautifully said.
Yeah. Anybody listening, call David. Go for it.
Call
Simar.
David. Yeah, too. No, and what maybe as maybe an additional build on that. I'm curious, David, with this fund in particular and coming into the climate and impact space and ReFi space, I'm curious if there's ways you've approached it differently as an investor too, showing up for founders, and what, ways in which you've thought about how capital can really flow into the space regeneratively, sort of holding a space and an intention that really is, let's say, of greater service to what's happening, right, and the emergency that we're all in.
Yeah. I'll take that in two parts. Like, how is this fund and investing in this space different than what we've done in the past, and then talk more about how we're working within that with founders. It's the same and different. I think what we as Draft Ventures have always done is we've looked at these kind of multi-decade long themes that we can underwrite, which are $1 trillion plus markets. And I think early Draft Ventures, we said, SaaS software is eating the world. And we really call the second, phase of that, which was really like this consumerization of SaaS and prosumer and product-led SaaS. And then, we invested in companies like Notion there and others. And then this verticalized SaaS, where how do we take an industry and integrate with SaaS? And that was, our investment thesis inside in the real estate space. And that SaaS was like, this is a multi-decade, multi-trillion-dollar opportunity that we can get behind and underwrite. And then the next one was, was blockchain, and we saw that kind of early on and got to invest in some great companies like Definity, Internet Computer, and Protocol Labs, and Cosmos, and at their very early stages of funding, and got to see that whole journey of this space evolve, and so that was a theme. And so now we're seeing, we truly believe that this space of climate software and impact fintech, these are $1 trillion markets to really underwrite and understand in the same way we did in these last two big waves. This is a third wave that we're focused on, and this is why we're so excited here. And then within that, how do we do it? And I think there's some of the same how we want to show up, and some things we want to do very differently. And the things that we want to do the same is that RT and I have been operators as much as investors, and entrepreneurs as much as investors. And so when we really invest in a company, it's a partnership we have with those founders to be on that journey with them and to help them. And we always say we want to be your first call of that's when something goes great and you hit that milestone, you get that enterprise contract signed. And it's also when you hit a huge roadblock, whether your executive quits or you're running out of capital or whatever those things that happen. We want to know. We want to help you through that, and like that's how we build that relationship trust, and to be in that place of like, oh wow, I messed up. I'm vulnerable. Let's I need your help, as much as the rah, let's crush it, all that. So, I think we've done that really well because we're in that seat as entrepreneurs with these founders. And so a lot of our journey is sharing both of the ups and downs and the vulnerabilities of what we've been through as founders, and as we go through it, and as a way to hope that founders don't make those same mistakes. And I think how you want to move differently here is our Tia and I, my partner at Draft Ventures, and I have been CEOs of large companies, and a lot of the investing stuff over the last decade has not been it's been a side hustle as we've been building companies. And so with this new fund, it's so exciting to kind of claim this and own it fully, and actually step up into even a bigger leadership role in this space, in this industry, and talk on great podcasts like the ReFi podcast, and share some of our thinking, and not only help our companies but help the greater space. And that's again that collaboration I spoke of, and that entire ethos of, guys, we're all on this planet together. Let's all help each other. I think that's the big opportunity for us as investors.
Dang, man. Well, if you did all that part-time, I have no idea what's going to happen when you jump in feet first full-time. This is awesome. Super stoked to have you guys in this space, shaping this movement together. For all you entrepreneurs out there looking at making a difference, we'd love to invite you into this conversation. David, where can people find more about you? How can they get in touch? How can people get connected?
Yeah, so draftventures.com is our website. Look me up, shoot me an email. Happy to. Warm intros are great. If you know someone that knows me, that's the best way to get in touch with our Tia and I, is through an introduction. And I think you'll find me. I live in Austin, and find me around climate conferences, some Web3 conferences, although I tend spending more time at climate conferences and out of the Web3 space.
Like that bias.
As a bias, and would love to meet, to chat. Again, this is life's work for me, and if you share that type of drive, I think we'll have a lot to talk about.
What an honor.
Awesome, man. Thanks so much for your time. You have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, John, Simar. You guys are great stewards of the space, and a lot of gratitude to be here. Thanks.
Likewise, man. Cheers.